In 1789, Alexander Hamilton was appointed by President Washington to be America's first Secretary of the Treasury. The brilliant young statesman and economist immediately faced a serious problem. He was convinced that the new nation's survival depended on financial stability. But the long and costly revolutionary struggle had seriously depleted the government's coffers. One of the ways Hamilton planned to raise funds was by successfully collecting the taxes and shipping tariffs authorized by the Revenue Act, which had been passed by the first Congress at Hamilton's urging in 1789. To enforce collection of these duties, he asked Congress to construct 10 cutters, a broad designation that encompassed several types of small sailing ships from schooners to brigantines.
At the founding of the Revenue Cutter Service, there was no Navy. There had been a Revolutionary War Navy, but it had been disbanded. The Navy really doesn't become established until 1798. So for about 7 or 8 years, you have revenue cutters as the only naval armed force of the United States.
As the Revenue Service grew in later years, the term cutter extended even further to include a wide variety of designs. Everything from unarmed supply vessels and utility ships to swift warships that resembled naval destroyers were called cutters. Today, the term refers to all vessels in the Coast Guard fleet over 65 feet long. The original cutters, however, were under 50 feet long and mounted 6 swivel guns each. Built to emphasize speed and economy of operation, most were topsail schooners that carried large amounts of sail.
Topsail schooners had several advantages. One, it could sail close to the wind, which means it didn't have to tack as many times to get where it was going. The second advantage, it didn't require very many men. You could handle the sails from the deck. And for a small service that didn't envision having a lot of people, this was a very necessary ingredient for a ship.
Beginning with the Massachusetts in 1791, the early revenue cutters were a huge success, collecting revenues and preventing smuggling along the rivers, creeks, and inlets around the port cities of the eastern seaboard. By the time Hamilton left the Treasury Department in 1795, America's income from the cutters' operations exceeded $5 million per year, over $4 million more than all other taxes levied by the government combined. Soon, however, the young nation would call upon the cutters to take on other duties.
The Revenue Cutter Service did a great service by eradicating the pirates in the Caribbean. Many sailed out of the old French and Spanish possessions down there. The cutters were so effective, in fact, that they really pushed them off the American coastline.
It wasn't long before yet another mission was assigned to the cutters, a mission that would have far-reaching effects on the future Coast Guard. In response to the huge increase in sea traffic that accompanied the country's expansion during the mid-19th century, in 1831, the Treasury Department directed a revenue cutter to cruise the east coast of the United States in search of persons in distress. Never before had any government given one of its agencies the specific task of searching for those in danger on the high seas, and it is a job that is still among the most important for the United States Coast Guard. But the cutter's humanitarian endeavors were not limited to search and rescue missions.
Well, I think the greatest ship that the Coast Guard has ever had has been the Coast Guard cutter Bear. She had a phenomenal history and career, both in the Revenue Cutter Service, but she also later served in World War II. It was the platform for many rescues, and it's just a phenomenal career from start to finish for that ship.
In 1890, the Bear, a 3-masted sailing ship with supplementary steam power, delivered 17 Russian reindeer to Alaskan Eskimos whose traditional food supply had been decimated by commercial hunters. In giving the Eskimos the means to help themselves, Captain Mike Healy of the Bear began a humanitarian relief effort that within 50 years resulted in a herd of reindeer over 500,000 strong. Though collecting tariffs and combating smuggling remained the principal task of the Revenue Service cutters, they had also undertaken wartime missions to fight alongside the United States Navy, providing some of the most stirring moments in Coast Guard history. In 1799, Congress authorized the President to transfer the Revenue Service fleet to the Navy during periods of hostility. The cutters soon proved their worth in this new role during the so-called quasi-war with France, which had begun 1 year earlier. During the 2-year conflict, the recently built revenue cutter Eagle, a brigantine armed with 14 guns, used her superior speed and armament to defeat the French privateer Bonpère and single-handedly captured 9 other French vessels. In total, U.S. revenue cutters fighting during the war were credited with capturing 21 French ships, many of which outnumbered them in both men and guns. Cutters would continue to provide peerless naval military service in every U.S. naval conflict, from the War of 1812 to the Vietnam War. In 1861, during the era of steam paddle-wheel-assisted cutters, the Harriet Lane would even be credited with firing the first naval shot of the Civil War. But as heroic as these early battles were, perhaps the finest wartime hour for the cutters occurred years later, in the stormy arena of the North Atlantic, where some of the most perilous clashes of World War II were fought. April 1943. A convoy of merchant ships carrying vital war supplies from the United States to Great Britain was crossing the North Atlantic. Among its escorts was a Secretary-class cutter named the Spencer. Steel-hulled vessels driven by steam turbines, the Secretary-class cutters were 327 feet long and capable of attaining speeds of nearly 20 knots. They were also armed with a forward-mounted 5-inch gun, as well as torpedoes and depth charges. Their maneuverability, long range, and heavy armament made them ideally suited to protecting convoys from a variety of threats, but mainly the lurking menace of submarines. Suddenly, a wolf pack of 4 German U-boats pounced on the convoy. Responding quickly, the cutter sped to the attack. It drove off one of the German subs, but not before another had successfully torpedoed a merchant ship in the convoy. While helping to rescue the survivors, sonar detected yet another U-boat on the attack. Arriving just as the sub had another merchant ship in its sights, the cutter launched a lethal barrage of depth charges. Forced to surface, the cutter charged in to finish off the damaged submarine with machine guns and 5-inch gunfire. It was the Spencer's second victory over a U-boat in less than 2 months. Coast Guard cutters like the Spencer were instrumental in helping to win the campaign against the German U-boats. Later classes of cutters also served with distinction during the wars in Korea and Vietnam.